my name is Anna. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. I am a UI UX designer at Firemonkeys. And I've been at Firemonkeys for about 3.5, almost 4 years now. But I originally came from board games. I worked at a board game company in Sweden. And then a couple of years back, I moved down to Melbourne, decided I wanted to live here where it was sunny. Yes, Melbourne is sunny compared to Sweden. I fell into this job, and I ended up on The Sims Freeplay, where I kind of found my niche as a UI UX designer and discovered that I really enjoyed working with interactive games and seeing how people actually interact with the games that we produce, as opposed to board games where you just kind of create something and you send it out there, and then you never actually get to see what people think or feel or experience. Look at this first-class service. Thanks, Tony. I haven't had coffee today. Thanks, Tony. And then, yes, so then I moved on to Need for Speed, which is where I've been for the past couple of months. So, what is UX and UX design? And there's a lot of fancy textbook definitions for all of these terms, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of big words in one sentence is confusing, and words are hard, okay? So in true UX fashion, allow me to rephrase all of these textbook definitions into normal people words. So, if this is your player, and that's your game, then UX is the user experience. It's the way that your player experiences your game. And this is our game development team. Then UX research is the way that we understand our player and identify their needs and motivations, and we take that information back to the team. And then UX design is the way in which we use this information to design the gaming experience. Yes? Awesome. It's important to note that UX research and UX design, while they're both under the big, the big UX umbrella, they're actually two completely different worlds of knowledge, and they're generally done by two different people with different skill sets, where UX research is data-driven and analytical and interacts with people and analyzes the player behavior and motivations. It doesn't actually do any visual work, where UX designers take that data and they make it visual. And they then use that to create products that provide meaningful and relevant and useful experiences to users. So this talk is about UX design, not about UX research. So whenever I talk about UX in here, this is UX design. And it's also important to note that UX design is very different from UI and UI art. So while a UX designer also needs to have knowledge of visual communication and design theory and color theory, they're not an artist. So a UI artist is a whole other thing again, and they deal with the actual visual interface of the game. And before we begin, you might be thinking, I don't work with UX, so why is this relevant to me? And it's true. I understand that not every studio has their own designated UX designer, but I'm hoping that you'll come away from here at least with some understanding of the importance of UX design and how it affects literally every aspect of the game development process, and how every person can put on the UX designer hat and incorporate aspects of it into their own day-to-day processes. Because, as we'll see later on, UX design touches everything and everyone. So put simply, good UX matters because it helps you identify pain points in your interface and your design. It'll save you time and money. It helps you make games that players actually want to play. And it's a great feeling to build a game that players love to play. But ultimately, the most important reason why UX matters is because it puts the user in focus. So my talk is in two sections. First, we're going to talk about how UX design helps our players, and then we're going to talk about how UX design processes help our team. Cool, so part one. Let's start off with how UX design is useful for solving player-facing problems. AKA, I just want to do the thing, why can't I do the thing? Oh no, none of my fonts are embedded. Oh man. They are actually embedded. Wait, hold on, is this the wrong? I'm really sorry, I'm going to open the other one. I'm going to do this in the middle of my presentation because I can't deal with that. As a UX designer, this is going to bother the absolute crap out of me. So I have a version that actually has Arial in it, so instead of my proper font. I'm sorry. But there is nothing that's going to bother me as much as that.
Is the other slide still running?
No, I closed it. If I do that, that should work. Yay! Cool. Sorry about that. That's going to annoy the crap out of me. So, I just want to do the thing. Why can't I do the thing? And before I begin, disclaimer. Game developers are not malicious. We're all human. We're all just people who love to make games. And we make the best decisions that we can based on the information that we have at the time. And so while game development is an ongoing conversation with our players, and I understand that within mobile game development this is more apparent, but even in the console space, if you're working on a console game, I'm assuming that you're testing before and after as well. And so I hope that I hope you're testing. But yeah, so it's important to have that ongoing conversation with our players because feedback leads to improvement and good design is always iterative. But sometimes it happens that we mess up. We create something that seems right to us, but we somehow miss the mark, and we fail our players by having poorly designed user experiences. And while there are an endless amount of ways in which players can be confused, there are 3 key areas I'm going to touch on today and suggest ways in which we can deal with them. So you might be familiar with some of these, and you might have dealt with yours differently, but here are some of the things that we've learned during our years on The Sims Freeplay and on Need for Speed No Limits. First up, overwhelming onboarding, confusing UI, and misunderstanding your players' motivations. I'll start off with overwhelming onboarding. So for those who might not be familiar with the term, onboarding is the process with which we familiarize new players with our game. And first and foremost, you want to make the experience as easy as possible. You want to be mindful of your player's first-time user experience and start off with easing your player into the game. Because, that cliche quote of you only get one chance to make a first impression. And players don't like being told what to do. They like feeling like they've discovered it themselves. And they're not going to read walls of text. In fact, people don't read full stop. I mean, I'm the person that just kind of clicks through the things, and I'm just like, yeah, sure, just get me to the good bit. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. So yeah, be mindful, cognitive load is overwhelming, and our brains can actually only hold about 3 to 4 bits of information at once. So try to make your tutorials as organic as possible. Allow your UX to be invisible and learn by doing. So let's take a look at how Need for Speed handles their first-time user experience. So the very first time that you open the game, you're dropped straight into a race, and you get an immediate taste of what this game is going to be like. So right from the get-go, you're given a clear objective and only 4 words. First to the finish, let's go. And the game pauses just slightly to give you however long you need to read the first basic instructions for controlling your car. So you're presented with a few words and clear visual cues in the UI. Once you touch the screen, the game continues. And then without any words or disruptions to your game, you're again given visual cues about where the road is about to curve. And the player is able to anticipate turns in the road and prepare, preventing them from crashing in their very first race. And I drive with reckless abandon, don't judge me. And the progress indicator up there in your left, it shows you how far along you are in your race, allowing you to know how close you are without actually impeding anything. But your player knows how close they are to the end. And then, at this point, we've gotten to a fork in the road. And without stopping your game or bewildering you, these simple visual cues that we've introduced already tell you exactly which road to take so as to prevent any confusion. Player knows exactly where to go. And by now, we feel the player is able to comfortably anticipate turns in the road and handle their car. So we introduce the next big mechanism, nitrous, a short speed boost. And 5 quick words, and you swipe up with the gestures, which brings us to the end of our first part of the tutorial race. So generally speaking, players don't like feeling like they're in a tutorial per se. They like to naturally navigate through the game with intuitive UX that subtly holds their hands along the way. But what happens when you're presented with the opposite experience? So I'm sure most of us have experienced this. You install a new app that you're unsure of, and the first time you open it, you're met with a create an account choke point. They're forcing you to think of a username, create an account, create a password, go verify your email, click all the things. Yeah, nah, not doing it. And that's not an experience that we'd ideally want to give our players. So instead, how's about giving our players something like this, where you install a new app that you're unsure of, you get to try it out and see how it works, create a personal experience that's relevant to you. And the Sims Freeplay is a great, well, Sims in general is a great example of how to do this, where you get to create an avatar, you get to create yourself or your family, anyone that you care about, you get to create your first little house. My first house was not that, but yeah, for example, a house. And then once you're prompted to save your work, that's when you get the create account screen. But now you've incentivized the player. The player knows why they're going to create their account. And so they do it. And they get to save their experience. Our second key area where players tend to struggle is when you have confusing UI. And frustrating UI experiences are such a common issue that developers seem to struggle with time and time again, pretty much every game ever made. And this can be, for example, with overwhelming onboarding, there's confusing messaging. For example, the player doesn't know what their objectives are at a given time. Buttons can be placed in unintuitive places. For example, your back button isn't actually in the top left corner, or there's a strangely colored button, so your continue button is red, for example. Or there might be blocked gameplay, so you see something in the interface, but it's locked, and you don't know how to unlock it. And once again, it's that thing of, I just want to do the thing. Why can't I do the thing? And there are so many things that we need to be mindful of. And sometimes even a well-organized and well-intended design may seem great on paper, but it's a completely different beast once it's actually put on device and into the hands of another human. A great example of this was the reset button on Need for Speed. So when you want to save your progress, the reset button was right underneath where that button was, which led to people accidentally deleting their games. Panic, 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 messages to customer support. Don't worry, we restored the games, no cars were lost. But this could have been so easily prevented if we had just tested it properly on device and actually gone through all of those processes. I'm pretty sure these screens were made by different people on the team. But thankfully, there's a simple solution. The reset button was simply moved to a new location. Ta-da, problem solved. So when it comes to designing UI, be mindful that your UI should be invisible. The user doesn't want to have to think about what they're doing. They just want to do it. And as Celia Hodent, great UX designer and researcher, she said, good UI is like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's probably not that good. Which brings us to our third key area that can cause frustration for our players, which is when we misunderstand what our players' motivations actually are. Misunderstanding your players' motivations happens. It happens. And it's never intentional, as I said before again. So, for example, on Need for Speed, we had the old Black Ridge Rivals feature. So Black Ridge Rivals was designed for late game players. It was designed to have a PvP focus. But as it evolved and players enjoyed it, we lowered the level requirement so that newer players could also be a part of it, without realizing that it actually didn't accommodate new players well. Players were able to just use their one fastest car for all of the races, and it meant that the range of cars that they had weren't being used. And players were frustrated because it meant that all the effort they were putting into unlocking new cars was actually not valuable. And it was, if it wasn't faster than the fastest car you already had, it felt pretty much useless. And that was actually damaging our core loop of collecting cars. And it's a great example of how you have initial goals, you shipped a feature to meet those goals, but then the feature evolved and the goals have shifted. So instead, we have to listen to players' critical feedback and try to work around that and iterate to improve their experiences. So we introduced Underground Rivals, which replaced the old Black Ridge Rivals feature. And the solution was to create a system that made your entire collection of cars valuable for different reasons. So different cars were eligible for different events, and then as a result, players felt that suddenly there was an actual purpose to collecting new cars and different things. And it's a great example, again, of the iterative process of we intended the feature to do X, it ended up doing Y, so you listen to your feedback and you have to respond to it. And so when the user says, I just want to do the thing, your game should say, sure, here's the button that helps you do exactly that thing. As I said before, good UI, good UX, invisible. And a great example of that, of how we identified our user needs and then designed solutions for that, was on The Sims Freeplay. So The Sims Freeplay has been around for 7 years. That's 7 years of live service. For a mobile game that releases content more or less every 6 weeks, that is a lot of content for our elder players. So they would unlock something new, for example, a new couch, and they had 300 old couches that they needed to browse through in order to find that one thing that they'd unlocked. So we introduced a simple little, new items button, and it's so simple, and yet we only introduced it a few months ago. Need for Speed had a similar thing where you just want to upgrade your car, and how do you upgrade your car? I need blueprints. Where do I get blueprints? And then we put that button in that says, get blueprints, which shows you exactly where you can get your blueprints to upgrade the car. And again, that was only introduced a few months ago. And it's a perfect example of having to listen to your players, identify what it is they actually need, and give them that exact thing that they need. Because we fail our players when we don't implement good UX processes, as I said in the introduction. Confusion leads to frustration, leads to giving up. And instead, we want to create positive gaming experiences. But how? Which leads us to part 2, the solution. So how can we use UX design processes to help our entire team and make our entire game development process faster and more efficient for everyone? AKA, the player just wants to do the thing. How can we help them do the thing? So, first of all, the first thing you need to do is identify who your actual target audience is. And this is a lot of work that we do in collaboration with the UX researcher. Remember I mentioned this person earlier? And identifying your target audience is often done together with the UX researcher, and I understand that not everyone has a UX researcher, and I'll actually be talking a little bit about exactly that. So if this is of interest to you, stick around for my next talk. More on that later. But basically, even if you don't have a UX researcher, there's so much information available where you can identify things. So we tend to use what we call player segmentation models. And they're a great way to categorize types of players into buckets, pretty much, depending on their motivations and their needs and their play styles. And it's a great way to help guide the way that you make your game decisions, because you're not making games for yourself, you're making games for your audience. And also, wherever you see this icon appear, this is all going to be stuff that I've put into a Google Doc. There's going to be a link at the end. Don't stress. It just means that this is a whole world of knowledge. I only have 45 minutes, but there are going to be touch points that you can then read more about later on if that's something that interests you. So this is an example of Google Play's player segmentation models, and a lot of big companies will use their own segmentation models. This one's readily available online, and they're not perfect, but they're a great way to categorize players into groups, depending. This one, for example, is based on the social influence and activity, as well as their passion or their fandom. And so you'll have your creative players that will, kind of go into the playful explorers. I would assume that The Sims Freeplay would go into the playful explorers. I know that they said that action and racing games will be under connected enthusiasts. So if I was to take a sweeping guess, I would assume Need for Speed would be under there. But again, they're just different ways of identifying player needs. And different target audiences have different needs, and it's really important to be mindful of that when you make games. And it's important as well to set your own thoughts and opinions aside, practice empathy, and genuinely learn what it is other people need. Remember this infographic from the intro? So now that we have a little more context on what a UX designer actually does, we can start looking at how UX design actually influences and works hand in hand with different roles within game development. So as I mentioned before, we get information from a UX researcher, and UX designers will collaborate with your DDs and producers. I know in a lot of smaller studios, those roles tend to overlap. because they'll need to collaborate with the UX designer to scope the product. Your designer wants to know what is their game actually, what are the levels going to look like, what are the screens going to look like in order to design the experience. Your UI artist needs to know how many icons am I making. QA needs to understand what is the actual game progression. Is this working the way it's intended? Your engineers need to know this button, when I press this button, what screen does that lead to? This timer over here, what time is that supposed to be showing? So we collaborate with literally every single person on the game development team. There are more roles here that I haven't covered in here, but for the sake of this. But also it's important to realize that sometimes people get sucked into their own wormhole of what it is they enjoy doing. For example, an artist might be, they're spending their time looking at lights and textures and the way that lighting effects are, working on that particular surface. Or a narrative designer is busy thinking about their amazing storyline. And yes, these are all important. They're so, so, so important. I'm not downplaying that at all, but sometimes it happens that team members get so focused on a thing that the team generally forgets to step back and consider the overarching player experience. And as someone that hopefully steps away from here with a bit of understanding of user experience design, I'm hoping that you're all going to take the time to advocate for the player's experience playing your game. So, where does it fit into the development process? This is roughly based on the Sims Freeplay process, where we have information. We start up there. We have information about our player base and about our game, and the producers or someone will have an idea. They'll collaborate with the designers. So the designers and producers will collaborate, flesh out this idea, create it. They'll bring in the UX designers into the prototyping. We'll start creating something. We'll test it. We'll realize that actually it's kind of wonky. It doesn't really work the way it's supposed to be doing. And so we iterate and we do that thing over and over again 50,000 times until we find that something is good enough, and then we really set out into the wild. And then that's kind of our life cycle process. And so UX design focuses mostly on this section. And the thing is, you don't actually you can do this entire cycle without involving code or art or anyone else. As long as you know what it is you're creating, you can start doing this entire cycle and create your entire system without actually hindering anyone else in pre-production. And so this starts with wireframes. Make them, and lots of them too. If there's one thing I can encourage people to do, is to make wireframes. So wireframes are a quick way to lay out content and functionality of a screen. They take into account the user's needs, and it shows their journey throughout a particular feature. And it helps establish the basic structure of a screen before any kind of art or strings or content or code or anything is added. So rapid prototyping and testing means that you can test things rapidly. And it helps align your entire team on what it is you're building. So before you've even started the creation process, if everyone has the wireframes and has aligned on these wireframes, everyone knows exactly what direction they're going in together. And so, naturally, it makes the entire process faster and more efficient for everyone. And also, they're quick and they're cheap. It takes 5 minutes to do a little sketch, and you don't need to be an artist to do these. In fact, it's better if you're not, because it's important that people focus on the content of what you're doing and not on the art. So the entire team should be aligned on what needs to be created when you're creating these ones here. And at this point, you can see exactly how many icons need to be made, what 3D assets need to be made, what buttons lead to what screens, and you can use these to start testing on people straight away. You don't actually need to have a functional game. You can use these here to start testing, and you should. And these are great for thinking through and validating your design decisions. For reference, these ended up looking like that, which was content from the Sims Freeplay Christmas update last year. But this is what it looks like when art and code and all of that has come in. You don't need all of that. That is where you start your process and align everyone. Because also it helps with scoping. If I'm to create a feature and I don't know how big it is, what screens I need, how many icons I need, how do I scope for that? It's completely impossible. Once I have this, however, that's tangible. I can scope for that. I can tell you exactly how long it's going to take for me to create all those screens. And a perfect example of how UX design played a crucial role during the development process was during the development of the pregnancy feature. So background information for those who might not be familiar. This update was important with big letters. Our players have been begging us to include pregnant bellies and pregnant sims into the game. As someone that isn't particularly fond of babies myself, I struggled with this. But it was the hands down #1 biggest feature that we would ever release. It was the single thing that people had requested the most out of everything, more than puppies. So I can't even begin to explain like how many times our social feeds got drowned in requests, and it got to a point where our elder players would start taking over like work from our community managers and just being like, it's not going to happen, guys, it's not going to happen, all right? Stop begging for this, it's not going to happen. But then as technology developed and our animation and our code team and our art team, they were kind of working on their side projects in their free time, we actually found ways that we can make this happen where the animations, like they wouldn't clip with the character rigs, and I don't know the tech voodoo behind it. I'm just an artist. But anyway, we were suddenly able to do this, and I can see one of our artists that was here. Yay! But we decided we were going to do the thing. So it started off with a design brief that, and this was the initial image that I got from our lead designer. And don't get me wrong, I love designer art. I love coder art. This was hacked together from one of our dialogues in like MS Paint, and it's amazing, and I love it. But it's really important. This is great because he's identified a few main key features that he wants represented on the main UI. But we have no concept of progression. We have no concept of the size of the feature, of what prizes we're having, of how do players set goals for themselves? What are the different ways in which they actually progress through this feature, and so on. So how did we go from this to this, which was the final thing? So we had all this information, we knew what it is we wanted, and we had all this data about our players, about their needs and motivations, but how do we organize all of that into a meaningful user experience for the most important feature ever? And it all started off with sketches. And as I said before, they don't need to be pretty. I struggle to draw a stick figure. So these were sketches that I did in meetings with our designers and our engineers and artists, and this is where we first start discussing our initial ideas, and it's at this point that the designer can say, actually this dialogue is lacking this particular information that we need, or your engineer can say, you know what, this button actually can't lead straight to this screen because code voodoo. And an artist can say, no, actually we can't display this character from this angle because, you know, XYZ reason, it just doesn't render like that. So straight away at this point, your team can tell you, they can give you a little bit of insight, and they wouldn't be able to do that if that's just in your head. So it's important to get that out there. And it shouldn't be pretty. Again, focus on the content. Next step up is producing our actual wireframes. There are lots of suggestions for wireframing tools. If you're not familiar with this already, some are paid. Adobe offers discounts to the students in here. Some are free. Again, I'll put all these in the link at the very end. But this is where we start to structure our screens and actually identify what information goes where. And this is also where we can start identifying the first problems in our layouts, you know, if there's any confusing dialogues or missing buttons or anything. Because it takes 5 minutes to move one box from one side of the screen to the other and rearrange things. And you won't have to throw away 3 weeks of art. So say you need to actually, you know what, we can't have this image there, we need something else entirely. You're not sacrificing someone else's time and money that they've spent creating a particular asset. Because the fact of the matter is, you are going to have to pivot. And pivoting, pardon? Oh, never mind. So pivoting doesn't mean throwing everything away. We take the learnings and we use that to guide the next iteration of the process. As I said before, game development is an iterative process. So none of these wireframes actually made it into the final pregnancy feature. What we actually ended up making didn't actually look like this. And we'd identified several pain points in here. There was too much information on some of these screens. It wasn't clear that there were different types of goal sets. Obviously, these are only 3 screens from like the 500 that I had made. But it wasn't clear that there were different goal sets or how they could progress through it. The value of the final prize wasn't clear, so we weren't incentivizing the player. Why do they actually need to put in the effort to go through this entire feature to unlock the big prize? And it, there were so many intricacies in this that wasn't clearly communicated. And this is why wireframes are so useful, because straight away, before we started creating this process, we just chucked that out. And I redid these, I think we went back to scratch 3 times, 4 times. And finally, we had something that we felt worked and was good. And that would have taken months if the entire team had been there. And that's costing your entire business time and money. And instead, that was 2-3 weeks of a couple of people working in the prototyping phase. Once we're all aligned on that, we start creating UX flows, user flows, sorry. And so from here, you have an overview of your entire feature. So this button leads to here, that opens this button leads to here, that opens this. And this gives you a general understanding of what is going to happen in your feature. This is really useful for your engineers as well. It's useful for your designers because they can suddenly think of all the little all right, what happens in this little side situation? What if this has happened and this has happened, then what, then what, then what? And it's very difficult to be able to think of all these things if you haven't actually got all the screens in front of you. And it's really useful as well. Print these out, put them on your wall, get your entire team to look at these, and then as you iterate, take them down, replace them. And then as your entire feature evolves as well, you can look at where you were beforehand and you see after as well how your feature has evolved. And I understand as well that our game, the Sims Freeplay is very UI driven. Yours might not be. So you might have 3 or 4 screens. That's okay. That's totally fine. Because our games are very UI driven and have a lot of history and legacy within them, there's a lot of screens, so a lot of our features can get very complicated, a lot more than this. But smaller features may only need a couple of screens. That's totally fine. And then you can take your wireframes and chuck them onto a device, create clickable prototypes, put it into people's hands, get someone to play through it and actually see what it's like to play through the feature. There's ways that you can do that without code or art again. There's suggestions for prototyping tools. And it just means that you're able to draw little hotspots and you click on it and it'll lead you to a next image, and you draw another little hotspot and you click on that and it leads you to another image. It's really simple to use. And it's so, so, so useful. Once the team is aligned on that again, that's where you hand over to the UI artist. And in a lot of studios, there's overlap with that, so that was me as well. So these are particularly useful when you make annotated high-fidelity mockups. So now you start to think of the colors, of the appearance, what it's actually going to look like, what are your assets going to be like. And also, annotating it is particularly useful for engineers because they see straight away, all right, this button is meant to lead to this screen. This timer is meant to show this amount of time. And they know straight away how it is they're supposed to hook up the feature afterwards as well. So, yeah, you can read. If you want to read, you can read. And so this is the final stage of the feature's pre-production. Once you've passed this point, this is where code and art can finally start to sink their teeth into actually creating the final product. And so when you get to this point, everyone knows exactly what it is they're doing. There's no confusion, and you can actually just start creating it and go. To kind of round it all off of, how did it go? So we did a live stream, and at its peak, we had about 4,000 viewers. And when we played the trailer and revealed the pregnant Sims, the chat blew up. It was nuts. And needless to say, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Our players were pretty excited about it. And that's really rewarding because that's what we make games for, right? We want to make games that people love to play. And so the ideation and the prototyping helped us in the long run. What had happened if we hadn't been able to go back to scratch and recreate this a couple of times? And we prepared early enough in our process, in our cycle, to allow ourselves time to iterate. We gave ourselves the time to start from scratch. And this is so, so, so important, to add a solid amount of time to your game schedule for UX design. It takes longer than you think. Test early, test often, fail fast. You want to fail as early as you can so that you have time to fix it. And as always, game design is an iterative process. So, to wrap it all up, here's the neat summary of the UX design thinking process. Start off by empathizing. You want to start by identifying what your players' key needs are. Identify what it is your game's goals are, and brainstorm. Get your entire team out and put all your ideas out there, because that leads you to the prototyping phase where you can start creating your wireframes and your clickable prototypes. And then test it. Test the absolute crap out of it, and then throw it all out and start from the beginning, and do this a couple of times. So to wrap up, have we identified who our target players are? Is our scope realistic? Has the team aligned on our wireframes? Have we tested our prototype? Have we identified the players' main frustration points? How are we going to resolve them? And most importantly, are we going to build the crap out of this awesome idea now? A little shameless plug. So if you're sitting there thinking, okay, all of this sounds great, but how do I go about actually getting all this information that I need then? So stick around, folks. So next hour, right here, I'm going to be doing user testing in under an hour. So we're going to be covering one-on-one user interviews. And it's going to be a practical hands-on workshop where everyone gets to think about their game that they're working on. And I'm going to run you through some techniques about how to conduct great user interviews, and then what you can do with that information, which will kind of be a perfect symbiosis to this talk. So yeah, and also there are puppies. So there you go. If there's one screen you want to photograph, that's the one. There's a Google Doc with all the information on it. It covers this stuff. It's also got the links from my UX research talk. And I'm going to take a second. We good? There's a few phones still up. Sick. If there's anything that you're missing from that document, or if you have suggestions on what could be added to it, I'd love to hear it. Hit me up on the Twitters. And if you have any questions and you don't want to ask them here, feel free to grab me afterwards in the break, or I'll be around at Games Week all week, or just slide into the DMs. My DMs are open. Yeah, and I think that's it. I'm really upset about my fonts. I baked them in and everything. Does anyone know why baked-in fonts don't show up on a Mac? Oh well. Any questions? Yes?
Do you find any challenges of being a UX designer then interacting with the game designer, where they feel maybe it's their vision, it's their game, and then you tell them maybe they should do something different?
Yeah, and that's actually something that I speak about in my next talk, because it's sometimes hard to convince someone that's so passionate about their idea to let go of that idea. If you put it out there and it's just not working, it's very difficult to convince someone to let go of that. And that's why testing is so important, because they have to see people struggle with it before they realize they have to let go of their thing. And it doesn't mean that you have to start from scratch again. It's an iterative process. You can find, what was the key thing? What was it that you were most passionate about, and how can we fix that? How can we make it more user-friendly and not lose that thing that you cared about? So yeah, test it. Just test it. Get them to see how other people are struggling with it. Yeah.
How do you go post-launch on a game? How do you kind of balance between, if you say need to change legacy content and UX based on kind of the current state of the game, how do you balance between what you think would be kind of the best UX and the best experience for a new player versus a player who's been experiencing that and is used to the current way of doing it?
Yeah, that's really, really hard, and that's actually something that I did a lot on The Sims Freeplay. So because this was, The Sims Freeplay was made back when we were on iPhone 3. It's still live now. I have like a graph of our player, like the like numbers of players on each devices, and there are still people, even though we don't support the iPhone 3 anymore, we still, even though we don't cater to the iPhone 4, we still technically support it. There's still people who play on the iPhone 4. So like, you have to be mindful of people that have been playing for a long time and on older devices and things. And I guess the advantage of working on a mobile game is that you can do 6 weekly push updates, so you can change things gradually. And like visual things, for example, the visuals of what the game looked like, if you were to Google up the old UI for The Sims and compare it to what it looks like now, it's completely different. But you do it sneakily. You kind of start like removing some of those like embosses, and you start removing some of the like little effects on the UI, and you don't do it because you don't want to shock your players. You don't want to completely change something and suddenly they don't know how to play your own game anymore. Like you said, you don't want to confuse your elder players. But yeah, there's ways in which you can slowly adjust something. And then sometimes, like on Need for Speed, sometimes you have to just strip the entire old feature, and you let people know communication is key. You let people know this particular thing that we had in the old game is coming to an end. Let people know, and then introduce a new feature to replace it and explain why it's better. And a lot of the time, people are going to be very understanding if they just understand why it is you're changing something. Anything else? Yeah?
Any games that come out recently that you look up to in terms of their UX approach?
Ooh.
Or the inverse.
I'm the worst person to ask because I only play one game. I'm one of those quote unquote bad gamers because I just play League of Legends every day. Don't judge me.
Did you take any lessons from that specifically? Or?
Yeah, like from UX design process, I think it was League of Legends was really hard. Who's played League, by the way? A fair amount. Cool, about half the room. Awesome. Sick. Let's play afterwards. But I think it's such a hard thing because there is such an overwhelming amount of information. There is so much content, so much intricacy, so much detail that you need to understand. There's so many levels of strategy within it about like, okay, I'm not going to get into detail, but I think that they have done a relatively good job at onboarding new players in terms of like the absolute first time experience. But I think like I would love to work at Riot, like despite all the culture stuff that's been out lately, but like I would love to work at Riot and work on that middle ground. So they do the first couple of games really well, but then how do you get people to understand like the depth of all the strategy inside the game? Because I think that's missing. That middle player section is missing. And yeah, I think like breaking the game down into layers and having like different kinds of tutorials. Like I say tutorials, but I really mean like a game, like an organic game where they kind of introduce new things and ask you to focus on different aspects of the game. So, and the same way that in the first tutorial, all you do is like, hey, here's how you attack minions, here's how you take towers. Maybe have another one where you say, all right, in this one, you just focus on vision control. And on this one, now all you do is focus on creep score or like minions. Then this one, you only focus on this. So you provide a player with a safe environment where they can just focus on that one thing. They do have the practice tool. I don't know. Like, sorry, I'm rambling. Their UI is real, like slick on the new client though. Did anyone see when they chucked out the old client and introduced the new client? Yeah, that was real good. That was real good. And all the little like, something that I love about real good UI is when it's juicy, and when you press a button and you just like, it's just so satisfying. You just want to keep pressing that button. And it's something about like the animation effects and the light effects and the sound, and like sound design is so important as well. Everything contributes to the user experience. And so I think that, yeah, their work on the new client has been really good.
How do you cater to others, for example, other countries and stuff, and their localization of icons and different sort of colors?
Yeah, that's a big That's a great question. That's a big thing of what we do is localization. So we not only have different languages, we have completely different alphabets. And so it means that on a lot of our icons, we can't actually use text. So sometimes it's a bit of a mishmash of trying to create an asset that you know you can organically plug text into afterwards in the layout tool. We have our own internal layout tool that we use. With Need for Speed, all of their branding and stuff is just baked in. The logos are they're in English, and that's just how it is across all the languages. The Sims has a little bit of leeway because they use Simlish, and so it's a made-up language and has made-up letters, so you get away with a lot of it. And all of the communication that needs to be localized is actually player-directed. It's not actually part of the game world. So anything that says "Hey salon" or anything, that's just in Simlish. So that can be the same across all languages. But then the little dialogues that pop up that say, "Hey, you need to do X, Y, Z because you want to unlock X, Y, Z prize." All of that can be localized. It does mean that we do need to think of string lengths, for example. So if you have a button, you have to think about how big does this button have to be, because even though a word might be 4 letters in English, trust me, in German it's going to be like this. So it means that sometimes you have to accommodate things for localization. Be mindful. You generally get a feeling for how they tend to be once the translations come in after a while, once you've done it for a bit. But what you can also do, and this has been really useful now that I've moved on to Need for Speed and we learn from other teams, is setting string count. So saying to, for example, the people that do your localizations, hey, for this screen, sure, use the space. We've got scrolling text box. Try to not write an essay, but that's fine. But then on this particular screen, we have max 12 characters. Stick to it. And they have to abbreviate, they have to find the words, that's on them to figure that out. But you have the power, this is your game, you're the developer, you have the power to be able to give a maximum string count.
Awesome, thank you very much.
Cool, thanks. Yeah.
How would you recommend practicing this sort of thing? Because obviously you kind of have a finite amount of games you can work on in your life.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for that, I suppose, or strategies?
Take a game that you really enjoy, that is clunky and frustrating, and redo it.
Okay.
And it doesn't even need to be a game. Apps are actually really good for this because you don't need to think about entire game progressions and things. If you just want to work on UX design and prototyping, apps are a great thing to do. Take an app that has a simple function and that is just difficult to use, and just redo it. And then, you don't need to be able to hook up any coding or anything. Just do your wireframes, chuck it into InVision or Proto.io or anything, and you can put it straight onto a device and click through all of your art.
Thanks.
No worries. Does anyone want to talk about League?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to do that as well.
He's a favorite character.
Oh, that depends. What are we playing? I actually have a pentakill Sona tattooed down my leg. I really like her because she's a metalhead and she's covered in tattoos, and it was the first character that I started playing ranked with, because I'm a support main. It was a great way because Sona's she's not mechanically difficult, and it meant that I was able to focus on macro strategy and actually the bigger gameplay rather than mechanics. And that's where I lost everyone. Thanks so much.